Sorry about that. I accidentally closed the camera down. Okay, so like I was saying, because sexual violence is relational in nature, oftentimes some of the biggest disturbances happen in the domain of relationship. So, in terms of kind of sexuality, oftentimes survivors can polarize. They can either go to kind of hypersexuality, which means kind of much more sexual than before, and maybe kind of indiscriminately sexual, um, kind of moving towards unsafe sexuality. Sometimes as kind of a recapitulation or repetition compulsion, or on the other hand, becoming very afraid of sex afterwards, not wanting to connect sexually, it feeling really scary. Um, some of the other things that we see is what we would expect. So, having difficulty trusting in relationship, feeling insecure, kind of reticent about connecting, feeling betrayed, often a sense of really betrayal, often because the perpetrator is someone who we've known and trusted. Oftentimes, too, feeling helpless or powerless in relationship, and this is huge. Honestly, I mean, it happens quite common because when we've been violated, that's inherently a disempowering experience. Okay, so oftentimes what happens afterwards then is I can't really advocate for myself. I feel unsafe communicating my boundaries or communicating what I need, or really voicing my discomfort about something. And so oftentimes kind of recovering or repairing that ability to defend or assert for oneself is critical. Um, And then oftentimes too, another piece that's less obvious is that, like I was saying earlier, because we become kind of cut off from ourselves, from the lives inside of us that have become so scary, we sometimes lose touch with how we feel, and actually how we're feeling both emotionally and somatically. And when we can't contact that, we can't really experience intimacy, because if I can't know what I need or what I want or what I feel, I can't really connect with you if I can't connect with myself. So oftentimes what we see is kind of folks being in relationships in kind of a people pleasing way. So it's kind of like, I'm focused on kind of what you want, and I don't really know what I want. Or maybe I think that I don't really want a whole lot or need a whole lot. Um, and so oftentimes being able to reconnect with oneself and work through kind of those lingering somatic and emotional symptoms allows for greater intimacy with others. Um, in terms of physical symptoms of sexual trauma, as I mentioned before, oftentimes we kind of turn our anger inward, so we can turn to self harm or self destruction, oftentimes from a place of helplessness. Um, have a vast variety of health issues, really very common, kind of in the front part of the body, so in the GI system, in the kind of cardiac system, often in the neurological system as well. Um, and as I kind of mentioned, we can be, when we start to touch into our body, have a lot of kind of overwhelming or uncomfortable sensations that persist, oftentimes again in the front part of the body, because that's where kind of our vagus nerve runs right here. Um, and like I said before, kind of on the low state, we can feel depressed. It can look like depression, really not having a lot of motivation or feeling, quite tired, foggy. And lastly, in terms of spiritual symptoms, oftentimes when something so kind of abruptly horrible happens, it can really call into question a lot of our pre-existing beliefs. And that happens especially with faith. It's hard to understand kind of how God or one's higher power could allow, something so horrible to happen. So it can create a real disconnect between that person and their higher power, as they're kind of unable to make meaning, make kind of coherent meaning out of what happened. And oftentimes those questions are really coming up, kind of like, how could this happen to me? What did I do to deserve this? Is often common because we're trying to find a simple kind of cause and effect, trying to make meaning out of something that was inherently kind of chaotic. Um, and to just this kind of sense of kind of existential isolation, sense of kind of I don't really matter, or sense of I don't belong here, I don't, my life doesn't have um, really any significance in the grand scheme of things, which can really be huge, to feel that kind of one's place in the world has been really abruptly kind of uprooted. Okay. So I'll just kind of briefly touch on here some, factors related to resiliency, because the truth is that we're very different in terms of how people respond after a traumatic event. So two people can go through the same thing. One person's able to integrate it and move on with their lives, and another person may struggle for years and years with debilitating symptoms. Why is that? So I just want to touch on that briefly. So how quickly and easily we can recover depends on a lot of different factors. So some of them are kind of the quality of our relationships throughout our lives. So what we know is that secure, loving relationships are really a protective factor in being able to cope with very the opposite, an unsafe, violating relational experience. And then also exposure to environmental stressors and adverse childhood experiences, belonging to a marginalized group, access to needed resources, and a pre-existing trauma history. So all of this to paint the picture of, if we go through a sexually traumatic experience and we have a lot of kind of protective factors, which is kind of the opposite of all those things on board, then our systems are going to be much more likely to be able to process what happened to us more quickly and more easily and return to our baseline if our baseline was quite strong or healthy, resourced. On the other hand, when we have a lot of kind of stressors that our systems are having to manage, especially if we have a history of other traumatic experiences that we haven't been able to process and integrate yet, then that's really going to impact how we experience a next or, a current traumatic experience. And so, all of that to say that when we've gone through a lot of kind of, could be like big T traumas, huge things, or just kind of chronic stressors, being in an unfavorable environment, dealing with poverty and oppression, that sense of kind of being a threatened, separate self becomes much more ingrained. And so, this idea, of like, feeling safe and feeling connected, feeling a deep sense of kind of belonging in the world. And the world is basically a loving place that welcomes us, where we're celebrated. We all kind of crave that. We really want that. And for some of us that have had so much trauma, it's like, what? That it's so novel to even imagine that kind of world. So this kind of ends my portion of the sharing, and Rebecca is going to be sharing next about developing the ability to regulate. It's kind of like, okay, so what do we do with all of these symptoms portion so that we can restore our ability to experience safety and connection and joy and aliveness, really so that we can kind of come back into the world again, and come really out of the shadow of our trauma. So thank you so much for listening.